The wind howled through Kodiak Harbor like a living thing, carrying with it the sharp bite of salt and snow. Fishing boats rocked gently in their berths, their masts creaking against the frozen night air. The entire island was locked in a winter hush, the kind of silence only the Alaskan wilderness could hold. But that quiet was about to shatter. Inside a tiny diner off Mill Bay Road, the television over the counter flickered between static and breaking news. The local anchor's voice trembled slightly, as if she could barely believe the words herself. After 27 years, authorities have announced an arrest in the 1998 murder of 19-year-old Emily Larsen. The fork in Helen Murray's hand clattered to her plate. She was in her late 60s now, her hair silvered, but she remembered Emily's face as though she'd seen her yesterday. Everyone in Kodiak did. Around the diner, murmurs rose like wind through spruce trees. A fisherman in a battered parka leaned back in his booth. "An arrest," he whispered. "After all this time?" At a corner table, a man in his 40s stared into his coffee, his knuckles pale against the ceramic mug. He didn't look up, didn't join the conversation. Across town, the same words spilled from radios and cell phones, carried through grocery aisles, gas stations, and ferry terminals. The news spread faster than the cold. And with it came a flood of memories people had buried for nearly 3 decades. 2 blocks from the harbor, Detective Alejandro Ramirez stood alone in front of a small memorial on Mill Bay Beach. A cluster of frozen flowers poked through the snow, their petals brittle and gray from countless winters. Emily's picture, laminated and weathered, stared up at him from beneath a dusting of ice crystals. Her smile was soft, hopeful, frozen in time. He tugged his coat tighter, the February wind cutting deep. For Ramirez, this wasn't just another case. He'd been a rookie back in '98, barely 3 months on the force when Emily Larsen vanished. He still remembered the frantic search parties, the divers combing the icy shoreline, the sound of Emily's mother's screams when they found her body near the rocky inlet. Ramirez had promised himself, and her family, that he'd find whoever did it. But the case had gone cold. Evidence degraded. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved, died, or stopped talking. Eventually, the Larsen file got boxed, stored on a dusty shelf, forgotten by everyone except a few haunted souls like him. Now, after all these years, the promise he'd made was finally within reach. At Emily's childhood home, a weathered blue bungalow on Spruce Cape Road, Linda Larsen, Emily's mother, stood at the kitchen window clutching the edge of the sink. The phone call had come less than an hour ago. They got him, the detective had said. She still couldn't process it. Outside, her husband David stacked firewood, his movements stiff and mechanical. He hadn't cried when they lost Emily, at least, not where anyone could see. Tonight, though, his shoulders shook beneath the weight of something too deep for words. Linda's eyes drifted to the framed photo on the wall, Emily at 17, wearing a faded mariner's hoodie, grinning wide as she held up a freshly caught salmon. "Finally, baby," she whispered. Finally. By dusk, Kodiak streets were crawling with unmarked SUVs and satellite trucks. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, the old case files had been dragged into the light, their secrets bleeding into the cold air. The name of the suspect hadn't been released yet. But the rumors were already spiraling. Some said it was an outsider passing through town that summer. Others swore it was someone in uniform, someone sworn to protect. The island felt divided between hope and dread. Hope that the Larsen family might finally see justice, and dread that the truth, when it came, would hit too close to home. Because deep down, most people knew, on an island like Kodiak, there are no strangers. Later that night, Detective Ramirez stood outside a modest cedar-shingled house on the west end of town. His breath fogged the air as he stared at the lit window upstairs. Inside, the suspect sat at a kitchen table, sipping tea with trembling hands. Ramirez's phone buzzed. A text from his captain. "We go in tomorrow. 0600. He looked up at the frozen stars. 27 years. 27 winters, each one colder than the last. Tomorrow, the silence would break. The summer sun hung low over Kodiak Island, painting the harbor in streaks of gold and orange. Fishing boats bobbed gently in the water, their hulls clinking softly against the docks. Above them, the gulls cried and circled, swooping low over scraps tossed into the bay. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and drying kelp, the island's lifeblood. And walking briskly along the dock that day was Emily Larsen. At 19, Emily carried herself with the restless energy of someone caught between two worlds, the wild, isolated beauty of Kodiak and the promise of something bigger beyond the horizon. Her faded mariner's hoodie was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing tanned arms flecked with sun. She wore scuffed hiking boots, her jeans cuffed at the ankles, and her dark brown hair, always a little wild from the sea breeze, was twisted into a loose braid. Her green eyes sparkled as she waved at an older fisherman mending nets nearby. "Morning, Bill," she called. The man grinned, nodding. "Emily, you still planning on ditching us for the big city?" She laughed, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Not ditching. Just pausing. I'll be back before you know it." Emily was saving for college in Anchorage, planning to study marine biology. It wasn't just a career for her, it was a calling. She spent hours sketching tide pools and scribbling notes about seal behavior in a battered journal she carried everywhere. She loved this island, its wildlife, its people. But she wanted more than Kodiak could give her. She had dreams bigger than the sea, her mother, Linda Larsen, would later say, her voice trembling as she flipped through Emily's journals years after her death. But she always planned on coming back. That summer, Emily worked double shifts at Pacific Bay Cannery, hauling boxes, labeling tins, and making just enough to scrape together her tuition. Her best friend, Samantha Sam Green, worked alongside her. Sam was her opposite in many ways, brash where Emily was thoughtful, loud where Emily was quiet, but they balanced each other perfectly. She was the kind of person who'd give you her last $20, Sam recalled during a 2003 interview. Didn't matter if she needed it. That's just who Emily was. On their lunch breaks, the two girls sat cross-legged on overturned buckets behind the cannery, sharing peanut butter sandwiches and swapping dreams about the future. "You'll be the one saving whales," Sam teased one afternoon. "I'll be the one stuck gutting halibut for the rest of my life." Emily grinned, shaking her head. "Not if I drag you with me. We're gonna do something amazing, Sam. Just wait." Emily's life wasn't perfect, though. Beneath the bright surface, there were currents few people noticed. She'd recently broken things off with her boyfriend, Tyler Briggs, a 21-year-old dock worker she'd dated for nearly a year. Friends said the split was messy. Tyler didn't take it well. "He wasn't a bad guy," Sam said later. "But he didn't like the idea of Emily leaving Kodiak. He wanted her here. With him." Emily also started keeping certain things to herself that summer. She'd grown quiet around her parents, especially her father, David Larsen, who worked long hours as a maintenance supervisor at the local power station. Linda remembered walking into Emily's room one night to find her daughter staring out the window, silent, her journal open but blank. "You okay, Em?" she asked softly. Emily hesitated, then forced a smile. "Yeah, Mom. Just thinking." But Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was weighing heavily on her daughter's mind. Despite whatever shadows hung over her, Emily still radiated warmth wherever she went. She volunteered weekends at the Kodiak Marine Wildlife Center, helping injured seabirds and orphaned otters. Staff there remembered her as magnetic, someone who could coax even the most frightened animals into trusting her. "She had this way of listening," said Dr. Karen Hollis, the center's director. "Not just to people, to everything. To the wind, to the ocean. She'd notice things others missed." Emily also adored photography. On her days off, she hiked out to Miller Point or climbed the bluffs above Fort Abercrombie, camera slung around her neck. Her photos, dozens of them later recovered from undeveloped rolls, captured Kodiak in intimate fragments. Tide pools glittering under the sun, a lone bald eagle silhouetted against gray clouds, friends laughing around a driftwood fire. She saw beauty everywhere, Sam said years later, her voice cracking. Even in this tiny place we all wanted to leave. The last known photo of Emily was taken at a summer bonfire on July 11, 1998. A group of friends gathered at the edge of White Sands Beach, their faces glowing in the firelight, marshmallows skewered over driftwood flames. Emily stood slightly apart, barefoot in the cool sand, laughing at something out of frame. In the photo, her braid had come undone, strands of hair whipping in the sea breeze. Her eyes were bright, cheeks flushed, alive. Less than 48 hours later, she would vanish. When news of Emily's disappearance spread, Kodiak froze. This was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where people left doors unlocked and car keys in the ignition. Crime wasn't supposed to happen here. "She was our girl," Helen Murray, the diner owner, would later say. Sweet, curious, always smiling. Losing her, it wasn't just a tragedy for her family. It was like the whole island lost a piece of itself. Over time, the Larsen family became something more than neighbors. They became symbols. Symbols of grief, of unanswered prayers, of a wound that refused to close. Emily's photo hung in every grocery store, ferry terminal, and post office for years after her death. Even now, nearly 3 decades later, candles still burned at the little memorial on Mill Bay Beach. Children who hadn't even been born when Emily died grew up hearing her story whispered like folklore. She was supposed to leave this island, Sam said in a 2024 interview. She was supposed to have a whole life ahead of her. College. Maybe kids. All of it. Instead, we got 27 years of silence. But that silence had finally broken. For the Larsen family, the arrest brought no joy, no victory, only a flood of emotions too tangled to name. Relief mingled with anger. Closure with heartbreak. Because Emily Larsen wasn't just a victim in an old case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. A bright thread torn from the fabric of a small Alaskan town. And as Kodiak braced itself for the revelations to come, one question lingered in the frozen air. Who could carry this secret for 27 years, and walk among them like nothing happened? Kodiak Island, Alaska, July 11th to 13th, 1998. The weekend started like any other on Kodiak Island. Summer brought long days, sunlight stretching nearly to midnight, and a strange, restless energy hung in the air. Teenagers gathered on beaches, fishermen unloaded their catch, and bonfires lit the horizon like scattered lanterns. For Emily Larsen, it was supposed to be just another weekend with friends. Saturday, July 11th, 5:15 p.m. Pacific Bay Cannery. The clang of machinery filled the air, the sharp scent of fish and brine clinging to every surface. Emily finished her shift, signing out on the timesheet with a quick flourish. Her co-worker and best friend Sam Green remembered it vividly. She was in a good mood, Sam said in a 1999 interview. Tired, yeah, but excited for the bonfire that night. Before leaving, Emily paused by the locker room mirror, twisting her braid tighter and dabbing on a bit of lip balm. She wasn't one for heavy makeup, but that night she wanted to feel different. Free. Saturday, July 11th, 7:45 p.m. White Sands Beach. By dusk, the bonfire was already roaring. Driftwood stacked high, sparks swirling into the soft twilight. Someone had dragged a boom box onto the sand, blasting Third Eye Blind over the wind. Emily arrived with Sam, barefoot and laughing, carrying a six-pack of soda under one arm. Friends remember her dancing, teasing, snapping Polaroids. She kept running down to the shoreline, Sam said. Letting the waves hit her feet, spinning around with her arms out. She was happy that night. Several people would later recall seeing Emily deep in conversation with Tyler Briggs, her ex-boyfriend. Witnesses disagreed on what they saw. One friend claimed they were arguing, voices raised over the music. Another swore they were laughing together, like old times. Tyler himself told detectives later that they had simply talked things out and parted on good terms. No one could say for sure what was true. Saturday, July 11th, 11:23 p.m. Road to Mill Bay Harbor. After the bonfire, Emily decided to leave early. Sam begged her to stay, but Emily insisted she was tired and had an early shift the next day. She hugged me and said, "Text me when you get home," Sam remembered. But she never did. Two separate witnesses saw Emily walking barefoot along the dirt road that led from the beach toward Mill Bay Harbor. One, an older couple driving home, said she looked calm, smiling faintly. The other, a dock worker heading to his car, claimed she seemed agitated, walking fast, glancing over her shoulder. Those conflicting details would haunt investigators for decades. Sunday, July 12th, 12:14 a.m. The cannery parking lot, security camera footage. The grainy footage from Pacific Bay Cannery's lone security camera showed Emily walking past at 12:14 a.m., her braid loose and hoodie tied around her waist. She stopped briefly, glancing toward the shadow of a parked truck at the far end of the lot. Investigators later tried to enhance the footage, but the angle was poor and the truck's license plate unreadable. Sunday, July 12th, 12:30 a.m. Mill Bay Harbor. This was the last confirmed sighting of Emily Larsen alive. A fisherman named Jonas Reed reported seeing her near the docks, leaning on the railing, staring out at the dark water. He waved, and she waved back. She didn't seem scared, Jonas said in his statement. Just quiet. Like she was thinking about something. But Jonas also admitted he'd been drinking that night. His memory wavered under questioning, and some detectives doubted he saw her at all. Sunday, July 12th, 1:05 a.m. Unknown location. Somewhere between Mill Bay Harbor and her house, Emily vanished. Sunday, July 12th, 9:40 a.m. Larsen residence. When Emily didn't come home that night, Linda Larsen assumed she'd crashed at Sam's place. But by morning, panic set in. Linda called Sam. "No, she's not here," Sam said, confused. "I thought she went home." By 10:15 a.m., Linda was at the Kodiak Police Department filing a missing persons report. She never just disappeared, Linda told Detective James Porter, the lead investigator at the time. She always calls. Always. Sunday, July 12, 12:30 p.m. Initial search efforts. Dozens of friends and volunteers combed the beaches, back roads, and docks. Flyers with Emily's photo appeared on shop windows within hours. Detective Porter coordinated search parties, deploying dogs and divers, but there was no trace. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing. She just vanished, Porter said later. It was like the earth swallowed her whole. Monday, July 13, 7:12 a.m. Rocky Inlet, south of Fort Abercrombie. 2 days after the bonfire, a local fisherman spotted something tangled among the rocks at low tide. At first, he thought it was driftwood. Then he saw the braid. Contradictions and red flags. The discovery of Emily's body sparked more questions than answers. Her hoodie was missing, though her shoes were folded neatly beside her. There were no defensive wounds on her hands. Her purse and camera were gone, never recovered. The tide patterns suggested she wasn't killed where she was found. And then there were the unsettling details from witnesses. Tyler Briggs' alibi, he claimed he went straight home after the bonfire, was shaky. No one could confirm his whereabouts after midnight. A cannery co-worker later confessed she saw Emily arguing with someone else that night. A man she didn't recognize. An unregistered truck was spotted leaving Mill Bay Harbor around 12:40 a.m., but it was never traced. The case began splintering into theories and dead ends almost immediately. Community reactions. Kodiak descended into fear. Parents tightened curfews. Doors were locked for the first time in decades. The rumor mill exploded. It was Tyler. Everyone knows it. No, it was a stranger passing through on the ferry. Cops are covering up for one of their own. Detectives chased every lead, but each ended the same way, nowhere. By late 1999, the case was already losing momentum. Haunting last moments. One image haunted the investigation for years, the Polaroid from the bonfire, taken hours before Emily's death. In the far background, just beyond the circle of light, a shadowed figure stands at the tree line. The photo was too blurry to identify them. 27 years later, that single photograph would become critical evidence. The air that August morning in Sitka, Alaska, was heavy with mist, the kind that clung stubbornly to the pines and blurred the line between sea and sky. Fishing boats bobbed lazily in the harbor as gulls screeched overhead, their cries sharp against the muffled quiet of the town. It was the kind of morning where people moved slowly, clutching steaming mugs of coffee, trying to shake off the chill. For Deputy Mark Ellis, a 32-year-old Sitka police officer, it started like any other day. He had just finished his first cup of coffee when the dispatch crackled through the radio. Unit 2, we've got a possible welfare check. Caller reports a vehicle parked near Harbor Point Road since last night. Driver appears unresponsive. Mark frowned, grabbing his keys. Harbor Point Road wasn't exactly isolated, but it wasn't somewhere you lingered overnight either. A stretch of dense forest bordered the coast there, and unless you were hiking or fishing, there wasn't much reason to be out that way. He headed toward his cruiser, unaware that the next hour would mark the beginning of one of Sitka's darkest chapters. The discovery. The vehicle in question was an old 1980s Ford Bronco, tucked into a gravel pull-off just off the road. As Mark pulled up behind it, he noticed immediately that the driver's side door was cracked open. Something in his gut tightened. Sitka Dispatch, this is Unit 2. I've got visual on the vehicle. I'm approaching on foot. Stand by. The forest around him was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional drip of condensation falling from the leaves. As he neared the Bronco, the details began to sharpen. The layer of dew clinging to the windows, the faint metallic tang in the damp air, and, most chillingly, a dark stain running down the inside of the open door. Blood. Mark's hand went instinctively to the holster at his side. Hello? He called out, his voice low but firm. Sitka Police Department. No response. He stepped closer, peering inside. That's when he saw her. The victim. Jessica Monroe, 24, sat slumped across the driver's seat, her head leaning against the window, lifeless eyes staring at nothing. Her blonde hair, once vibrant and full of life, was matted with blood. The front of her sweatshirt bore a single, small tear, just beneath her collarbone, and beneath it, the crimson spread of a stab wound. Mark's breath caught. He had seen his share of accidents and bar fights in Sitka, but this was deliberate. Pulling back, he forced himself to breathe, then keyed his shoulder MIC. Dispatch, I've got a 10 to 54. Female, mid-20s, appears deceased. Possible homicide. Requesting backup and crime scene unit. He swallowed hard, glancing around instinctively. Whoever had done this might still be nearby. Backup arrives. Within 15 minutes, the gravel pull-off was crawling with law enforcement. Detective Alejandro Ramirez arrived next, his expression tight and grim as he ducked beneath the crime scene tape. Ramirez had been with the Sitka PD for over a decade, calm under pressure, methodical, and known for his ability to piece together narratives from chaos. He leaned into the Bronco without touching anything, scanning the scene. Single stab wound, he muttered, almost to himself. No signs of defensive injuries. Looks like she didn't even see it coming. Beside him, CSI technician Karen Holt began photographing the interior, her camera clicks punctuating the silence. Wallet still here, Karen noted. Cash untouched. Jewelry intact. If this was a robbery, they didn't take anything. Ramirez's jaw tightened. So, not random. Unraveling the details. While the body remained in place, the surrounding area told its own story. Fresh tire tracks led away from the Bronco, veering back onto Harbor Point Road. Ramirez crouched near them, tracing the tread marks with his gloved hand. 2 vehicles, he murmured. One's hers. The other? Wider tread. Maybe a truck or SUV. Whatever it was, it left after she was attacked. Mark approached cautiously, his face pale. You think she knew them? Ramirez straightened, his expression unreadable. Someone wanted her dead, he said simply. And they wanted it clean. The call to the family. Back at the station, the grim responsibility of notifying Jessica's family fell to Officer Dana Russell. She sat in her cruiser outside the Monroe residence, rehearsing the word she dreaded most. Inside, Jessica's mother, Helen Monroe, answered the door with a warm smile that faded instantly when she saw Dana's face. No, Helen whispered before Dana even spoke. No, please, no. Dana swallowed hard, her voice breaking slightly. Mrs. Monroe. I'm so sorry. Jessica was found this morning. She's gone. The wail that escaped Helen's throat was raw, animalistic, a sound no mother should ever have to make. Building the timeline. Back at the station, Ramirez began piecing together Jessica's last known movements. Through witness statements, texts, and social media posts, a timeline started to emerge. August 11, 1988, 6:30 p.m. Jessica clocked out of her shift at the Dockside Cafe, where she worked part-time as a server. 7 p.m. spotted by a friend, Lacey Carter, filling up her Bronco at a local gas station. 7:15 p.m. Jessica exchanged a brief series of text messages with her younger sister, confirming plans for a family dinner the next evening. 7:30 p.m. Last known sighting. A passerby recalled seeing her Bronco heading toward Harbor Point Road. After that, nothing. A community shaken. By noon, news of the murder had spread like wildfire. Sitka was a close-knit town where violent crime was almost unheard of. Neighbors stopped each other on the street, exchanging theories in hushed tones. Parents clutched their children a little tighter, fishermen checked their locks twice before heading out to sea, and small businesses closed early, their owners shaken. Jessica had been one of their own, bright, compassionate, and deeply rooted in the community. To think that someone had stalked, attacked, and killed her here, in their peaceful little corner of Alaska, was unthinkable. Key evidence emerges. Later that evening, Karen returned from processing the Bronco with a crucial detail. We lifted partial prints from the passenger side door, she said, setting a folder down on Ramirez's desk. They don't match Jessica's. Whoever got in with her, or leaned against that door, wasn't her. Ramirez scanned the report, his jaw tightening. What about DNA? Karen hesitated. There's trace material under her fingernails, but it's minimal. We'll send it to the lab, but it could take weeks. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. In 1988, DNA testing was still in its infancy, slow and often inconclusive. For now, they'd have to rely on old-fashioned detective work. The unanswered questions. By nightfall, Harbor Point Road was empty again, but Ramirez remained haunted by the scene. Why Harbor Point? Why no defensive wounds? Why leave her valuables untouched? One thing was certain, whoever killed Jessica Monroe had been precise, deliberate, and confident enough to vanish without leaving much behind. Ramirez stood by the Bronco one last time as the mist rolled in off the Pacific, swallowing the headlights and blurring the world into shades of gray. Somewhere out there, he thought, the killer was watching the same fog. And waiting. Foreshadowing. The murder of Jessica Monroe wouldn't just fracture her family and devastate a quiet Alaskan town. It would also mark the start of a decades-long mystery. Leads would dry up, suspects would emerge and fade, and the case would eventually go cold. But buried deep in that Bronco, in the fibers of Jessica's sweatshirt and beneath her fingernails, lay the evidence that would one day crack the case wide open. For now, though, the fog kept its secrets. August 1998, Anchorage, Alaska. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of saltwater from the Cook Inlet as Anchorage detective Michael Reynolds stepped out of his unmarked car. The hum of distant traffic was muffled by the heavy silence blanketing the quiet residential street. Ahead of him, crime scene tape fluttered gently in the breeze, its stark yellow warning slashing across the doorway of a modest two-story house, the home where 23-year-old Jessica Monroe had been found brutally murdered less than 24 hours earlier. Reynolds had seen his fair share of violent crime, but something about this one felt different. Inside, the Anchorage Police Department's crime scene unit was already at work. The hum of portable lights and the quiet click of cameras filled the air. Jessica's body had been removed hours ago, but the image of where she had fallen still hung heavy in the room. The overturned coffee mug on the kitchen floor. A broken picture frame nearby, the smiling faces of Jessica and her younger sister cracked beneath a web of glass. And most chilling of all, a smear of blood along the hallway wall, as though she had tried to crawl away before the end came. Reynolds crouched near the kitchen counter, where forensic investigator Claire Donnelly was dusting for prints. Reynolds, any luck yet? Donnelly, plenty of partials, but nothing clean. Whoever did this wore gloves, or was very, very careful. Reynolds nodded grimly. That matched what he suspected. This wasn't random. This was controlled. Early leads and dead ends. Back at the precinct later that day, Reynolds and his partner, Detective Sarah Green, sat hunched over stacks of files and witness statements. They had begun the painstaking process of reconstructing Jessica's final 48 hours. Her mother, Evelyn Monroe, had been the first to sound the alarm when Jessica missed their scheduled Sunday dinner, something she never, ever did. When Evelyn arrived at Jessica's home that evening, she found the front door slightly ajar and the lights on. Within seconds, she stumbled onto the horror inside. Evelyn's interview was heart-wrenching. Her hands trembled as she recounted what she'd seen, her voice cracking as she whispered. Evelyn Monroe, she was lying there on the kitchen floor. I thought maybe she'd fainted. But then I saw. After the interview, Evelyn sat quietly in the hallway, clutching Jessica's photo. Reynolds knew better than to disturb her. Jessica's boyfriend, Tom Keller, quickly became a person of interest. They'd been together for almost a year, but friends described the relationship as volatile. There were reports of heated arguments, jealous outbursts, and one incident where Jessica confided to a friend that Tom had shown up unannounced at her work, demanding to know who she'd been talking to. Reynolds and Green brought Tom in for questioning. Green, where were you Saturday night? Tom Keller, home. Watching the Mariners game. Ask my roommate, he'll tell you. Tom's alibi checked out, his roommate confirmed they'd been together all night, and timestamped security footage from a nearby convenience store backed it up. Dead end. Forensic challenges. The forensic work was frustratingly slow. The late 90s were a different world for crime labs. DNA testing was in its infancy, databases were limited, and processing times were painfully long. At the scene, the team had collected several promising pieces of evidence. A single latent fingerprint on the back door. A strand of dark hair found clenched in Jessica's hand. Trace amounts of skin cells beneath her fingernails, suggesting a struggle. But back then, those samples were practically useless without a known suspect to compare them against. Reynolds made sure everything was catalogued meticulously, hoping future technology might succeed where they were failing now. Reynolds, to Donnelly in the lab. I don't care if it takes a week or a year, don't lose a damn thing. If we can't catch him today, I want to make damn sure we can catch him tomorrow. Interviews and rumors. Detectives fanned out across Anchorage, talking to anyone who knew Jessica. From co-workers at the local bookstore, they learned she was well-liked, but recently, distracted. One friend, Maya Lopez, recalled Jessica mentioning a creepy guy who had been hanging around the store a few times, someone Jessica thought was following her home. Maya, she didn't want to make a big deal about it. Said she'd seen him outside a couple times. I told her to report it, but you know Jessica, always thought she could handle things herself. Despite the lead, the bookstore's security cameras were primitive, grainy footage that captured little more than blurry shapes. They couldn't identify anyone. The pressure builds. By late September 1998, 6 weeks after Jessica's murder, the case had stalled. Reynolds felt the weight of failure in every headline. Young woman brutally murdered, no arrests. Is a killer walking free in Anchorage? Community fear mounted. Parents were walking their daughters to work. The bookstore's late-night hours were cut short. Inside the precinct, tensions were high. One late night, Green found Reynolds alone at his desk, staring at Jessica's autopsy photos. "Green, you need to go home, Mike." Reynolds, shaking his head, "I keep thinking we missed something. There's something in this file, something small, and I'm just not seeing it." But the truth was brutal. They had no murder weapon, no solid suspect, and nothing tying anyone directly to the crime. The forgotten DNA. Before boxing up the case, Reynolds made one final request. Every biological sample was to be stored carefully in the department's evidence freezer. "Reynolds, someday, science is gonna catch up. And when it does, we'll be ready." It would be a promise that hung over him for nearly 3 decades. Foreshadowing the breakthrough. In 1998, Reynolds didn't know that a future technology called genetic genealogy would change everything. He didn't know that tiny fragments of DNA sitting in evidence bags would one day unlock secrets everyone thought had been buried forever. But for now, in 1998, the case was cold. The box marked Monroe, Jessica, homicide was sealed and shelved. And somewhere out there, Jessica's killer walked free. The camera lingers on that evidence box, gathering dust in a forgotten corner of the Anchorage PD archives. Fade to black as the words appear on screen. For 27 years, Jessica Monroe's family waited for answers. But in 2025, a tiny piece of DNA would blow the case wide open. The case had stalled. By the winter of 1998, almost 3 years after Rachel Monroe's body was discovered near the frozen Kenai River in Alaska, the investigation had gone cold. What had once been a hive of activity, detectives poring over evidence, forensics teams combing every inch of the scene, and interviews running late into the night, had slowed to a quiet hum of frustration. Inside the Kenai Police Department, Detective Frank Halvorsen sat at his desk, staring at the evidence board. Dozens of photographs were pinned up, Rachel's smiling face, the crime scene shots, sketches of possible routes she might have taken the night she vanished. Red yarn connected timelines, witness statements, and dead-end leads. Frank rubbed his temples and muttered under his breath. 3 years, and not one damn inch closer. Across the hall, Detective Marissa Cole, the youngest member of the task force, was reviewing an old stack of tips that had come in during the first few weeks of the investigation. The Coles had been relentless back then. Sightings, rumors, names whispered by people too scared to go on the record. Most were nonsense. A few had seemed promising, but each eventually led nowhere. "Frank," Marissa said softly, approaching his desk. "I rechecked the tip from that guy in Soldotna who claimed he saw Rachel at the gas station the night she disappeared." Frank looked up, weary-eyed. "And?" "It's useless. He mixed up the dates. He wasn't even in town that night." Frank cursed under his breath and leaned back in his chair. Another one bites the dust. The frustration builds. For Rachel's parents, Karen and Tom Monroe, the endless waiting was unbearable. They'd clung to hope at first, telling themselves that each passing day brought them closer to answers. But by 1998, their optimism had eroded into a kind of numb despair. Karen had stopped decorating the house for holidays. She avoided the spare bedroom, which still sat frozen in time, Rachel's posters on the wall, her journal stacked neatly on the desk, the scent of her lavender perfume lingering faintly in the air. Tom, once an easygoing man known for his warm laugh, grew distant and angry. He threw himself into work at the harbor, fixing boats until his hands were raw, anything to avoid coming home to the silence. One evening, sitting at their kitchen table, Tom slammed his fist down. "They don't care anymore, Karen," he said bitterly. "The cops, the media, no one's talking about Rachel. It's like she never existed." Karen stared at her mug, tears spilling silently into her coffee. "She existed," she whispered. "She still does." False leads and shattered hopes. By 2002, 7 years after the murder, detectives thought they finally had a breakthrough. A man named Gary Hensley, a drifter with a violent record, had been arrested in Anchorage for an unrelated assault. During questioning, he bragged about knowing things related to a girl killed in Kenai back in '95. The statement set off alarms. Detectives scrambled to interview him. Frank remembered sitting across from Gary in the cramped interrogation room, watching the man smirk. "Yeah, I know what happened to her," Gary taunted. "I was there." But as the interview went on, it became painfully clear he was bluffing. The details he provided were wrong. The time, the location, even Rachel's clothing. He'd picked up pieces from news reports and stitched together a false confession, hoping to cut a deal on his pending charges. When Gary's alibi checked out, detectives were crushed. Frank ripped his notes in half and threw them across the room. "That's the third false confession this year," Marissa muttered, shaking her head. "People like him should rot," Frank growled. "Wasting our damn time while Rachel's killer is still out there." The toll on the town. As years dragged on, the town of Kenai grew restless. At first, everyone had rallied around the Monroes, holding candlelight vigils and fundraisers to keep Rachel's case alive. But as the leads dried up, so did public attention. Some residents began whispering theories. "Maybe it was someone passing through," one woman said at the diner. "Or maybe it was someone we know," another replied, her voice low. Those whispers turned into suspicion, and suspicion turned into paranoia. Neighbors eyed each other differently. Friendships dissolved. A few families even moved away, unwilling to live under the shadow of an unsolved murder. For Karen and Tom, every whisper felt like a wound reopening. They couldn't go to the grocery store without overhearing theories about their daughter's final hours. Sometimes the cruelest suggestions came from people they'd known for years. A mother's mission. By 2005, a full decade after Rachel's death, Karen Monroe transformed her grief into determination. She founded a small advocacy group for families of unsolved murder victims, connecting with others across Alaska. Through vigils, petitions, and social media campaigns, she fought to keep Rachel's name alive. During an interview with a local radio station, Karen's voice trembled but carried resolve. "Someone out there knows what happened to my daughter. I will not let her be forgotten." Her efforts caught the attention of state investigators, and in 2007, the case was briefly reopened. Old evidence was re-examined, and detectives floated the idea of using emerging DNA technology to reprocess some of the biological samples collected at the scene. But there was a problem: the technology back then wasn't sensitive enough. The samples were degraded, partial, and nearly useless. It was another crushing disappointment. Detective Halvorson's breaking point. By 2010, Detective Frank Halvorson was nearing retirement. He had spent 15 years of his career haunted by Rachel's murder, carrying her photograph in his wallet as a reminder of the case he couldn't close. One night, sitting alone in his car outside the Monroe home, Frank stared at their darkened windows. "I'm sorry, kid," he whispered. "I promised your mom I'd find him. I failed you." The guilt consumed him. When he finally retired later that year, he left the department with a box of unsolved files, Rachel's case sitting on top. The family fractures. As the investigation dragged into its second decade, the Monroe family splintered under the weight of unresolved grief. Tom withdrew completely, rarely speaking at all. He started drinking heavily, spending long nights on his fishing boat, staring into the icy waters. Karen, meanwhile, grew closer to their youngest son, Ethan, who was just 10 years old when Rachel was killed. Ethan had grown up in the shadow of his sister's murder, struggling to forge his own identity while living with the constant comparison to a sister frozen in memory. "She was perfect," Ethan said bitterly during an argument one night. "You act like I don't even exist." Karen froze, realizing too late how much her obsession with the case had cost her living child. A faint glimmer of hope. By 2017, more than 2 decades after Rachel's murder, a new generation of detectives took over cold case files across Alaska. Among them was Detective Emily Carter, an ambitious young investigator determined to leverage next-gen DNA technology to solve cases long thought unsolvable. Carter reviewed Rachel's file late one night, spreading out the dusty evidence reports. Her eyes caught a small notation about a trace DNA sample recovered from beneath Rachel's fingernails, a sample too small to analyze in the 90s but potentially viable now. She made a note to submit it for retesting. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. Back in the Monroe household, Karen sat alone in Rachel's room, holding one of her daughter's old journals. She traced her fingers over the handwriting, whispering softly, "I'm still here, baby. I haven't stopped." Outside, snow fell quietly, blanketing the town in white, as if trying to cover the wounds of the past. But beneath that cold silence, the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The forest at the edge of Seward, Alaska, had always carried a certain weight. Even before Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner were found there, locals whispered about its shadows and the way sound carried strangely among the tall spruce trees. The case, already one of the most haunting unsolved murders in the region's history, began to take on a new, unsettling life of its own as years turned into decades without answers. Stories began to fill the silence that evidence could not. The murmurs begin. By the late 1990s, nearly 7 years after Keelan and Crystal's murders, the local newspaper, the Seward Chronicle, stopped printing regular updates. There were no arrests, no suspects, and no closure. But silence doesn't erase tragedy. People start inventing their own explanations when the truth stays locked away, said Deborah Deb Haynes, a lifelong resident whose family owned a diner off the highway. Every time someone new disappeared, every time we heard strange noises out by the cliffs, we thought, maybe it's connected. And so, a patchwork of legends began to grow. The Watcher in the Woods. One of the earliest myths was about a mysterious figure some swore they'd seen moving through the tree line near Lowell Point, close to where Keelan and Crystal's bodies were found. Local fishermen claimed to see a tall, shadowy figure lingering just beyond the reach of lantern light. Some described him as wearing a heavy parka, his hood pulled low, standing perfectly still among the trees, watching. For years, teenagers dared each other to drive down the winding gravel road toward Lowell Point at night. Some claimed they spotted glowing eyes in the brush. Others swore they heard heavy footsteps trailing them back to their cars. Of course, investigators dismissed these stories, but for locals, the myth of the Watcher became a way to personify their fear. The Hitchhiker's Curse. Another rumor came from truckers who drove the Seward Highway, which connects the small coastal town to Anchorage. Drivers began reporting sightings of a female hitchhiker with long blonde hair, always seen standing just past mile marker 13, the very stretch where Keelan and Crystal were last seen alive. She doesn't say a word, one long-haul driver told KTUU Anchorage News in 2004. You pull over, but when you look back, she's gone. Some claimed the ghostly hitchhiker was Keelan, forever searching for the road home. Others whispered it wasn't Keelan at all but a spirit trying to lure travelers to their deaths, a remnant of the violence that stained that patch of highway. While law enforcement never commented publicly, internally, reports show officers logged at least 27 separate calls between 2000 and 2010 describing the same phenomenon. The cabin nobody talks about. But the most persistent legend came from hunters, one that tied directly to theories investigators privately debated but could never prove. About 5 miles from the original crime scene, hidden deep in the forest, was a dilapidated hunting cabin. Locals said it had been abandoned since the early 80s, but stories circulated about strange activity there in the years following the murders. Teenagers claimed to have found bloody handprints on the walls. Hikers spoke of hearing muffled screams coming from the woods nearby. Some even reported seeing strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the property, markings nobody could explain. Detective Alejandro Ramirez, one of the original investigators, later admitted off-record that the cabin was searched in 1995. Nothing conclusive was found, but something about the place unsettled him. It didn't feel right in there, Ramirez said in a 2015 podcast interview. It was quiet, but not the good kind of quiet. Like the woods were holding their breath. Small-town gossip becomes law. As the years dragged on, Seward's identity became tied to the murders. True crime enthusiasts started traveling to Alaska to visit the sites where Keelan and Crystal were last seen alive. Local businesses capitalized, some reluctantly, others eagerly. A bar downtown started offering a cocktail called the Silent Spruce. A gift shop near the marina sold t-shirts that read, "I survived mile marker 13. Paranormal YouTubers set up camp in the woods, filming spirit box sessions near the abandoned cabin. For older residents like Deb Haynes, this commercialization felt like sacrilege. They turned our pain into a tourist attraction, she said bitterly. Keelan and Crystal weren't characters in a ghost story. They were kids. Real people. Her efforts caught the attention of state investigators, and in 2007, the case was briefly reopened. Old evidence was re-examined, and detectives floated the idea of using emerging DNA technology to reprocess some of the biological samples collected at the scene. But there was a problem. The technology back then wasn't sensitive enough. The samples were degraded, partial, and nearly useless. It was another crushing disappointment. Detective Halvorsen's breaking point. By 2010, Detective Frank Halvorsen was nearing retirement. He had spent 15 years of his career haunted by Rachel's murder, carrying her photograph in his wallet as a reminder of the case he couldn't close. One night, sitting alone in his car outside the Monroe home, Frank stared at their darkened windows. "I'm sorry, kid," he whispered. "I promised your mom I'd find him. I failed you." The guilt consumed him. When he finally retired later that year, he left the department with a box of unsolved files, Rachel's case sitting on top. The family fractures. As the investigation dragged into its second decade, the Monroe family splintered under the weight of unresolved grief. Tom withdrew completely, rarely speaking at all. He started drinking heavily, spending long nights on his fishing boat, staring into the icy waters. Karen, meanwhile, grew closer to their youngest son, Ethan, who was just 10 years old when Rachel was killed. Ethan had grown up in the shadow of his sister's murder, struggling to forge his own identity while living with the constant comparison to a sister frozen in memory. "She was perfect," Ethan said bitterly during an argument one night. "You act like I don't even exist." Karen froze, realizing too late how much her obsession with the case had cost her living child. A faint glimmer of hope. By 2017, more than 2 decades after Rachel's murder, a new generation of detectives took over cold case files across Alaska. Among them was Detective Emily Carter, an ambitious young investigator determined to leverage next-gen DNA technology to solve cases long thought unsolvable. Carter reviewed Rachel's file late one night, spreading out the dusty evidence reports. Her eyes caught a small notation about a trace DNA sample recovered from beneath Rachel's fingernails, a sample too small to analyze in the 90s but potentially viable now. She made a note to submit it for retesting. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. Back in the Monroe household, Karen sat alone in Rachel's room, holding one of her daughter's old journals. She traced her fingers over the handwriting, whispering softly, "I'm still here, baby. I haven't stopped." Outside, snow fell quietly, blanketing the town in white, as if trying to cover the wounds of the past. But beneath that cold silence, the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The forest at the edge of Seward, Alaska, had always carried a certain weight. Even before Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner were found there, locals whispered about its shadows and the way sound carried strangely among the tall spruce trees. The case, already one of the most haunting unsolved murders in the region's history, began to take on a new, unsettling life of its own as years turned into decades without answers. Stories began to fill the silence that evidence could not. The murmurs begin. By the late 1990s, nearly 7 years after Keelan and Crystal's murders, the local newspaper, the Seward Chronicle, stopped printing regular updates. There were no arrests, no suspects, and no closure. But silence doesn't erase tragedy. People start inventing their own explanations when the truth stays locked away, said Deborah Deb Haynes, a lifelong resident whose family owned a diner off the highway. "Every time someone new disappeared, every time we heard strange noises out by the cliffs, we thought, maybe it's connected." And so, a patchwork of legends began to grow. The Watcher in the Woods. One of the earliest myths was about a mysterious figure some swore they'd seen moving through the tree line near Lowell Point, close to where Keelan and Crystal's bodies were found. Local fishermen claimed to see a tall, shadowy figure lingering just beyond the reach of lantern light. Some described him as wearing a heavy parka, his hood pulled low, standing perfectly still among the trees, watching. For years, teenagers dared each other to drive down the winding gravel road toward Lowell Point at night. Some claimed they spotted glowing eyes in the brush. Others swore they heard heavy footsteps trailing them back to their cars. Of course, investigators dismissed these stories, but for locals, the myth of the Watcher became a way to personify their fear. The Hitchhiker's Curse. Another rumor came from truckers who drove the Seward Highway, which connects the small coastal town to Anchorage. Drivers began reporting sightings of a female hitchhiker with long blonde hair, always seen standing just past mile marker 13, the very stretch where Keelan and Crystal were last seen alive. "She doesn't say a word," one long-haul driver told KTUU Anchorage News in 2004. "You pull over, but when you look back, she's gone." Some claimed the ghostly hitchhiker was Keelan, forever searching for the road home. Others whispered it wasn't Keelan at all but a spirit trying to lure travelers to their deaths, a remnant of the violence that stained that patch of highway. While law enforcement never commented publicly, internally, reports show officers logged at least 27 separate calls between 2000 and 2010 describing the same phenomenon. The cabin nobody talks about. But the most persistent legend came from hunters, one that tied directly to theories investigators privately debated but could never prove. About 5 miles from the original crime scene, hidden deep in the forest, was a dilapidated hunting cabin. Locals said it had been abandoned since the early 80s, but stories circulated about strange activity there in the years following the murders. Teenagers claimed to have found bloody handprints on the walls. Hikers spoke of hearing muffled screams coming from the woods nearby. Some even reported seeing strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the property, markings nobody could explain. Detective Alejandro Ramirez, one of the original investigators, later admitted off-record that the cabin was searched in 1995. Nothing conclusive was found, but something about the place unsettled him. "It didn't feel right in there," Ramirez said in a 2015 podcast interview. It was quiet, but not the good kind of quiet. Like the woods were holding their breath. Small-town gossip becomes law. As the years dragged on, Seward's identity became tied to the murders. True crime enthusiasts started traveling to Alaska to visit the sites where Keelan and Crystal were last seen alive. Local businesses capitalized, some reluctantly, others eagerly. A bar downtown started offering a cocktail called the Silent Spruce. A gift shop near the marina sold t-shirts that read, "I survived mile marker 13. Paranormal YouTubers set up camp in the woods, filming spirit box sessions near the abandoned cabin. For older residents like Deb Haynes, this commercialization felt like sacrilege. "They turned our pain into a tourist attraction," she said bitterly. Keelan and Crystal weren't characters in a ghost story. They were kids. Real people. Her efforts caught the attention of state investigators, and in 2007, the case was briefly reopened. Old evidence was re-examined, and detectives floated the idea of using emerging DNA technology to reprocess some of the biological samples collected at the scene. But there was a problem. The technology back then wasn't sensitive enough. The samples were degraded, partial, and nearly useless. It was another crushing disappointment. Detective Halvorson's breaking point. By 2010, Detective Frank Halvorson was nearing retirement. He had spent 15 years of his career haunted by Rachel's murder, carrying her photograph in his wallet as a reminder of the case he couldn't close. One night, sitting alone in his car outside the Monroe home, Frank stared at their darkened windows. "I'm sorry, kid," he whispered. "I promised your mom I'd find him. I failed you." The guilt consumed him. When he finally retired later that year, he left the department with a box of unsolved files, Rachel's case sitting on top. The family fractures. As the investigation dragged into its second decade, the Monroe family splintered under the weight of unresolved grief. Tom withdrew completely, rarely speaking at all. He started drinking heavily, spending long nights on his fishing boat, staring into the icy waters. Karen, meanwhile, grew closer to their youngest son, Ethan, who was just 10 years old when Rachel was killed. Ethan had grown up in the shadow of his sister's murder, struggling to forge his own identity while living with the constant comparison to a sister frozen in memory. "She was perfect," Ethan said bitterly during an argument one night. "You act like I don't even exist." Karen froze, realizing too late how much her obsession with the case had cost her living child. A faint glimmer of hope. By 2017, more than 2 decades after Rachel's murder, a new generation of detectives took over cold case files across Alaska. Among them was Detective Emily Carter, an ambitious young investigator determined to leverage next-gen DNA technology to solve cases long thought unsolvable. Carter reviewed Rachel's file late one night, spreading out the dusty evidence reports. Her eyes caught a small notation about a trace DNA sample recovered from beneath Rachel's fingernails, a sample too small to analyze in the 90s but potentially viable now. She made a note to submit it for retesting. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope. Back in the Monroe household, Karen sat alone in Rachel's room, holding one of her daughter's old journals. She traced her fingers over the handwriting, whispering softly, "I'm still here, baby. I haven't stopped." Outside, snow fell quietly, blanketing the town in white, as if trying to cover the wounds of the past. But beneath that cold silence, the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The forest at the edge of Seward, Alaska, had always carried a certain weight. Even before Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner were found there, locals whispered about its shadows and the way sound carried strangely among the tall spruce trees. The case, already one of the most haunting unsolved murders in the region's history, began to take on a new, unsettling life of its own as years turned into decades without answers. Stories began to fill the silence that evidence could not. The murmurs begin. By the late 1990s, nearly 7 years after Keelan and Crystal's murders, the local newspaper, the Seward Chronicle, stopped printing regular updates. There were no arrests, no suspects, and no closure. But silence doesn't erase tragedy. People start inventing their own explanations when the truth stays locked away, said Deborah Deb Haynes, a lifelong resident whose family owned a diner off the highway. "Every time someone new disappeared, every time we heard strange noises out by the cliffs, we thought, maybe it's connected." And so, a patchwork of legends began to grow. The Watcher in the Woods. One of the earliest myths was about a mysterious figure some swore they'd seen moving through the tree line near Lowell Point, close to where Keelan and Crystal's bodies were found. Local fishermen claimed to see a tall, shadowy figure lingering just beyond the reach of lantern light. Some described him as wearing a heavy parka, his hood pulled low, standing perfectly still among the trees, watching. 4 years, teenagers dared each other to drive down the winding gravel road toward Lowell Point at night. Some claimed they spotted glowing eyes in the brush. Others swore they heard heavy footsteps trailing them back to their cars. Of course, investigators dismissed these stories, but for locals, the myth of the Watcher became a way to personify their fear. The hitchhiker's curse. Another rumor came from truckers who drove the Seward Highway, which connects the small coastal town to Anchorage. Drivers began reporting sightings of a female hitchhiker with long blonde hair, always seen standing just past mile marker 13, the very stretch where Keelan and Crystal were last seen alive. She doesn't say a word, one long-haul driver told KTUU Anchorage News in 2004. You pull over, but when you look back, she's gone. Some claimed the ghostly hitchhiker was Keelan, forever searching for the road home. Others whispered it wasn't Keelan at all but a spirit trying to lure travelers to their deaths, a remnant of the violence that stained that patch of highway. While law enforcement never commented publicly, internally, reports show officers logged at least 27 separate calls between 2000 and 2010 describing the same phenomenon. The cabin nobody talks about. But the most persistent legend came from hunters, one that tied directly to theories investigators privately debated but could never prove. About 5 miles from the original crime scene, hidden deep in the forest, was a dilapidated hunting cabin. Locals said it had been abandoned since the early 80s, but stories circulated about strange activity there in the years following the murders. Teenagers claimed to have found bloody handprints on the walls. Hikers spoke of hearing muffled screams coming from the woods nearby. Some even reported seeing strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the property, markings nobody could explain. Detective Alejandro Ramirez, one of the original investigators, later admitted off-record that the cabin was searched in 1995. Nothing conclusive was found, but something about the place unsettled him. It didn't feel right in there, Ramirez said in a 2015 podcast interview. It was quiet, but not the good kind of quiet. Like the woods were holding their breath. Small-town gossip becomes law. As the years dragged on, Seward's identity became tied to the murders. True crime enthusiasts started traveling to Alaska to visit the sites where Keelan and Crystal were last seen alive. Local businesses capitalized, some reluctantly, others eagerly. A bar downtown started offering a cocktail called the Silent Spruce. A gift shop near the marina sold t-shirts that read, "I survived mile marker 13. Paranormal YouTubers set up camp in the woods, filming spirit box sessions near the abandoned cabin. For older residents like Deb Haynes, this commercialization felt like sacrilege. They turned our pain into a tourist attraction, she said bitterly. Keelan and Crystal weren't characters in a ghost story. They were kids. Real people. The toll on the families. For the Schultz and Turner families, the spread of myths became its own form of cruelty. Keelan's father, Sean Schultz, once confronted a group of ghost hunters who were live streaming from the spot where his daughter's body had been found. "This isn't a damn TV show," he told them. "My girl died here. Show some respect." The Turners, quieter by nature, simply stopped engaging with the community altogether. Crystal's younger sister moved out of state, unable to handle constant whispers and morbid speculation. For the families, every urban legend was a reminder of the justice that never came. When legends turned dangerous. While most myths were harmless, some fueled paranoia and led to troubling confrontations. In 2007, a group of locals formed a self-proclaimed watch patrol, convinced a serial killer was still hunting in the woods. They carried shotguns, patrolled back roads, and openly accused strangers of being the killer. One incident nearly turned deadly when a man camping near the Lowell Point trailhead was threatened at gunpoint because his pickup matched a vehicle once rumored to be linked to the murders. Police eventually disbanded the group, but the damage was done. The case becomes folklore. By the 2010s, the murders of Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner had become less of an open investigation and more of a modern Alaskan folklore, a blend of fact, rumor, and supernatural embellishment. And yet, for all the talk of haunted hitchhikers, shadowy watchers, and cursed cabins, there was still one undeniable truth. Someone had killed 2 young women in the woods outside Seward, and gotten away with it. For every whispered story, for every legend born around campfires, one chilling question remained unsolved. Was the killer still out there, living among them? Foreshadowing the breakthrough. What no one knew, not the ghost hunters, not the watchers, not even the grieving families, was that buried deep in the evidence locker at the Seward Police Department sat a forgotten fragment of DNA. Something microscopic. Something investigators had missed. And when new technology finally unlocked its secrets decades later, the myths would crumble. Because the truth, as it turned out, was far darker than the legends. February 2022, Anchorage, Alaska. The icy wind cut through the skeletal branches of the spruce trees, scattering frost across the forgotten trail near Eagle River. A local hiker, Mark Holloway, trudged through the snow, his boots sinking deep into the crusted layers. He had walked this path 100 times before, but today something unusual caught his eye, a flash of dull metal sticking up from the frozen earth. Mark knelt, brushing away snow with his gloved hands until he uncovered the small object, a weathered pendant necklace encrusted with dirt and ice. Inside its cracked heart-shaped locket was a faded photograph of a teenage girl. Unsettled, he snapped a picture and sent it to the Anchorage Police Department, APD, tip line. The image would change everything. Detective Ramirez returns. 2 days later, Detective Alejandro Ramirez, the same investigator who had been a rookie when Jessica Monroe vanished in 1995, stared at the evidence bag on his desk. The pendant was confirmed to belong to Jessica. After 27 years, he muttered under his breath, his voice a mixture of disbelief and quiet resolve. For Ramirez, the case had never really left him. He had kept Jessica's photo in his desk all these years, a reminder of an unsolved promise. The pendant's discovery prompted APD's cold case unit to re-examine the evidence using modern forensic techniques unavailable in the 90s. Ramirez immediately authorized a full evidence audit. DNA technology, a door reopens. Back in 1995, investigators collected biological samples from Jessica's clothing, but testing was primitive then. The results were inconclusive and eventually shelved. Now, thanks to next-generation sequencing, the lab could extract touch DNA, microscopic traces left behind by mere skin contact. Within weeks, the forensic team reported back. They recovered a partial male DNA profile from Jessica's jacket zipper. The profile didn't match anyone in CODIS, the FBI's criminal DNA database. But it was viable enough to pursue genetic genealogy. This cutting-edge technique had cracked hundreds of cold cases nationwide. By uploading the DNA profile to open-source genealogy sites, investigators could build family trees to trace the suspect's lineage. Vanessa's obsession. Meanwhile, investigative journalist Vanessa Holt, who had been covering the Monroe case since 2018, sensed movement behind the scenes. One late night, she called Ramirez. "Vanessa, Alejandro, I know something's happening. You've been too quiet." Ramirez, "Off the record, we may have a lead. But don't run with it yet." "Vanessa, I won't. Just, tell me this isn't another dead end." Ramirez, "I don't think it is this time." Vanessa started digging into Jessica's old circle again. Classmates, neighbors, co-workers from her part-time job at the diner. People talked more openly now, decades removed from the fear that gripped the community in the 90s. One name kept resurfacing, Preston Wright, a handyman who lived 2 blocks from Jessica back then. The genealogy breakthrough. In April 2022, the lab called Ramirez. "Detective, we've got a hit." The genealogical analysis traced the DNA to a distant cousin in Oregon. By mapping out the family tree, analysts narrowed the pool down to 3 potential male relatives in Alaska. One of them was Preston Wright. Ramirez froze when he heard the name. Back in 1995, Preston had been briefly questioned but dismissed. He had a shaky alibi and no criminal record at the time. But after digging deeper into his background, Ramirez learned that Preston had since been arrested twice in the early 2000s for domestic violence, cases that never resulted in convictions but painted a troubling picture. The Silent Watcher. Investigators began 24/7 surveillance on Preston. Morning routine. He lived alone in a small cabin on the outskirts of Wasilla. Habits. Visited the same grocery store every Thursday, drank at a local bar most weekends, avoided close social connections. Odd behavior. He never mentioned Jessica's name, but locals said he became visibly agitated whenever her case came up on the news. Ramirez pushed for a covert DNA collection order. Officers followed Preston, waiting for him to discard something they could legally retrieve. They didn't have to wait long. One night, Preston left the Pioneer Bar and tossed a cigarette butt into a snowbank. Investigators swooped in. The call that broke the case. A week later, Ramirez sat in his office when the forensic lab director called. "It's him, detective. 100% match." For the first time in 27 years, they had their man. Ramirez leaned back in his chair, staring at Jessica's photo on the wall. "We've been waiting for you, Preston," he whispered. The family's shock. When the Monroe family received the news, reactions were mixed. Linda Monroe, Jessica's mother, broke down in tears. David Monroe, her father, sat silent, gripping his coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. Jessica's younger brother, now a father himself, simply whispered, "I thought this day would never come." For them, the arrest was bittersweet. Closure, yes. But also the reopening of wounds they had spent decades trying to heal. Vanessa gets the scoop. Ramirez finally gave Vanessa the green light to go public. Her headline the next morning read, 27 years later, breakthrough in the Jessica Monroe case. The article went viral, reigniting national attention. True crime podcasts, online forums, and Reddit threads dissected every detail of Preston's life. Preston's reaction. The morning after Vanessa's article dropped, Preston was seen pacing outside his cabin. Neighbors recalled his face turning pale when news vans arrived on the street. 3 days later, the APD obtained a warrant. The storm before the arrest. On June 5, 2022, unmarked SUVs rolled down Preston's gravel driveway. Inside, Ramirez's pulse pounded. As they waited for the signal, a light snow began to fall despite the summer season, Alaska's eerie reminder of frozen time. "This is it," Ramirez whispered. The team moved in. But Preston Wright wasn't going quietly. The first flakes of snow had started to fall again over Fairbanks, dusting the streets in white as if time itself hadn't moved since that terrible winter of 1997. But inside the Alaska State Troopers headquarters, the air felt different, electric, tense, full of the weight of unfinished business. For Detective Alejandro Ramirez, now 42, reopening a case this old wasn't just about justice. It was about ghosts. He had joined the force in the early 2000s, years after Keelan Schultz and Crystal Turner were killed, but he remembered the chilling newspaper headlines as a rookie. 2 young women vanish in remote Fairbanks woods. Bodies found days later, killer still at large. 26 years later, the case had become folklore, part of Fairbanks' collective memory. Families still whispered about it, truck stop diners still swapped theories, and the original victims' relatives, like Linda Hayes, Keelan's mother, still carried the unbearable weight of never knowing why. Now, a single phone call had changed everything. The breakthrough call. Ramirez sat across from Agent Emily Carter, 38, an FBI specialist in cold case homicides flown in from Quantico. The two had spent the morning combing through old files in the dusty archives. Emily laid out a manila folder on the table, her fingers tapping nervously against it. "Emily, this is it, Ramirez. This is what we've been waiting for." Ramirez, DNA. Emily, not just any DNA. A familial match. It had started with a Department of Justice grant, one of several nationwide pushes to revisit unsolved homicides with cutting-edge technology. They'd resubmitted the partial DNA profile recovered from a cigarette but found near the bodies back in '97. For decades, CODIS had come up empty. But this time, something was different. A match popped. Not direct, but close. Emily, second cousin. Male. Lives in Anchorage. "We're running the family tree now." Ramirez leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Ramirez, after 26 years. Digging up old wounds. Reopening the case meant more than DNA. It meant ripping open scars for the victims' families, and Ramirez knew it. That afternoon, he drove through the icy streets to Linda Hayes' home, the same house she had lived in since 1997. The wind howled across the frozen landscape, and as he approached the porch, Ramirez could see the flickering candle in the window, the one Linda kept lit for Keelan every single night. Linda opened the door slowly, her face lined by years of grief. "Linda, detective. I thought you forgot about us." Ramirez, gently, "We never forgot, Linda. We may finally have something." She hesitated, one trembling hand on the doorframe. "Linda, don't do this to me unless you're sure." Ramirez swallowed hard. "Ramirez, I can't promise you answers. But I can promise you we're closer than we've ever been." Inside her living room, the walls were still covered with Keelan's photos, school portraits, camping trips, candid Polaroids of her and Crystal laughing under endless Alaskan skies. Ramirez noticed that time had stopped there. It was still 1997 in Linda's heart. Returning to the scene. 2 days later, Ramirez and Emily stood beneath skeletal spruce trees, their boots crunching against the frozen earth where Keelan and Crystal's bodies were found. Emily scanned the area, reviewing old case maps. Emily, the forensics back then were prehistoric compared to today. No touch DNA, no ground-penetrating radar, no 3D scene modeling. Ramirez, hell, they didn't even preserve the cigarette properly. It sat in a cardboard evidence box for years. They reprocessed the site, collecting soil samples, vegetation, even fragments of clothing that had been missed in the original sweep. Portable scanners mapped the scene in 3D, revealing subtle depressions in the earth suggesting someone had dragged one of the victims farther than previously thought. This discovery shifted the entire timeline. Emily, if Keelan was moved, the killer had to have been here longer than we thought. Ramirez, meaning, he wasn't some random drifter. Theories that had once dominated, serial killers passing through Alaska's lonely highways, seasonal oil workers, or transient hunters, suddenly started to crack. Community reactions. When news broke that the case was being reopened, Fairbanks exploded with speculation. Local radio shows lit up with callers. Some swore they knew who did it. Others whispered about a conspiracy, that the killer had been protected, maybe even tied to law enforcement. At the Moose's Den, a local bar frozen in time, Ramirez and Emily met with Coyote, a jittery informant who claimed he'd overheard something years ago but had been too scared to come forward. Coyote's hoodie was pulled tight over his head, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. Coyote, low voice back then, there was talk. A guy, Manuel Ortega, Venezuelan, worked odd jobs at the pipeline camps. Said he knew a shortcut to the woods. People said he liked girls who looked like them. Emily, why didn't you come forward? Coyote, snapping because people like Ortega had friends. You disappear if you talk too much. That was the first time Ramirez heard the name Manuel Ortega connected to the murders. The lead that changed everything. 2 weeks into the reopened investigation, the lab report came back. The DNA familial match pointed toward the Ortega family. Manuel Ortega, now 45, had a record of violent assaults in Venezuela and was rumored to be connected to the Tren de Aragua gang, a shadowy network operating across South America and the U.S. back in the 90s. The Anchorage branch of the FBI had been tracking Ortega on unrelated charges, but he'd vanished in 2001. Ramirez slammed the folder shut, frustrated. Ramirez, we finally get a name, and he's a ghost. But Emily didn't flinch. Emily, ghosts leave footprints. We'll find him. A knock on the right door. A breakthrough came when investigators interviewed Sarah Morris, 30, a former waitress at a diner near the old pipeline camps. She remembered Ortega vividly, the way he'd stare, unblinking, at Keelan and Crystal whenever they came in for coffee before their hikes. Sarah, he scared me. Scared all of us. One time I saw him follow them out. I told the cops back then, but they said it was nothing. Her statement, combined with the DNA lead, gave Ramirez what he needed, grounds to officially name Ortega as a person of interest. Haunting parallels. Late one night, Ramirez sat alone in the station reviewing Ortega's file when something made his stomach turn. The cold case photos from other unsolved murders along Alaska's highways between 1995 and 2000 matched Ortega's movements almost perfectly. Ramirez, muttering, "Dear God, this wasn't random." Keelan and Crystal might not have been Ortega's only victims. The net tightens. By December 2023, the FBI and Alaska State Troopers traced Ortega to a small town in Chile, living under an alias. An extradition request was filed. For the first time in 26 years, there was hope. Linda Hayes lit her candle that night with trembling hands, whispering a prayer into the darkness. Linda, Keelan, baby, we're close. Ramirez stood outside, staring up at the aurora borealis streaking across the sky, vivid, ghostly green ribbons dancing above the frozen land. Ramirez, quietly, we're coming for you, Ortega. The reopened investigation had transformed from a cold case into an international manhunt. And for the first time, the killer's shadow wasn't untouchable. The Anchorage winter night was bitterly cold, the kind that burned the lungs and froze breath midair. Streetlights glowed dimly through a thin curtain of drifting snow, and the roads were slick with ice. Inside the Anchorage Police Department's Violent Crimes Unit, a sense of urgency gripped the room. After nearly 3 decades, the team had something solid, DNA evidence, verified and matched to a living suspect. For Detective Alejandro Ramirez, this was the moment he'd waited for since being assigned to the cold case 5 years earlier. He stood by the evidence board, hands buried deep in his pockets, staring at the faded photograph of Angie Reynolds, the 22-year-old woman whose brutal murder had haunted the city since 1998. Ramirez, quietly, to himself. It's time, Angie. We've got him. Across the room, Agent Emily Carter of the FBI paced near the table, scrolling through her tablet. She had been brought in months earlier when CODIS finally returned a hit from a newly uploaded DNA profile. Okay, she said, stopping abruptly. We have a 98.7% match on the DNA recovered from Angie's clothing. It belongs to Thomas "Tommy" Keene. 49 years old now. 2 prior arrests in the early 2000s for assault, but he slipped through the cracks. Ramirez's jaw tightened. He pulled Keen's mugshot from a file and pinned it next to Angie's photo. The contrast was jarring, Angie's bright, hopeful smile beside Keen's cold, almost vacant stare. 1. Surveillance begins. The next morning, the task force split into teams. Keen was living in Wasilla, about 40 miles north of Anchorage, in a modest ranch-style home tucked behind a row of birch trees. Detective Ramirez, Agent Carter, and 2 other officers parked in an unmarked SUV down the road. From their vantage point, they could see Keen's rusted blue Chevy Silverado parked crookedly in the driveway. "Guy works construction," Carter murmured, scanning through Keen's recent activity. "Odd jobs. No steady employment. Keeps to himself." "Fits the profile," Ramirez muttered, sipping lukewarm coffee. "But we need more than a DNA match to make this stick. We need patterns. Behavior. A trail." They watched for hours. Keen came and went twice, once to a small gas station, once to a hardware store. Always alone. No family. No close friends. He moved like a man who wanted to stay invisible. 2. Digging into the past. Back at headquarters, Ramirez and Carter pored through old files. Keen's name had never come up in the original investigation, a stunning oversight, given what they were now finding. In 1998, he'd been working as a part-time handyman at a lodge just 3 miles from where Angie's body was found. He wasn't interviewed. He wasn't even on the radar. Carter, unbelievable. He was right there the whole time. Ramirez, this case was chaos back then. Too many suspects, too little evidence, but now. Gestures at the DNA report. Now, we've got him boxed in. They discovered something else, a chilling pattern. Between 1997 and 2001, 3 other young women had reported harassment and stalking in the same area. None of those cases were linked, until now. 3. The wiretap. To strengthen their case, the team secured a wiretap warrant. 2 days later, the recorder captured a conversation between Keen and an old co-worker. Co-worker, heard the cops are digging up that Reynolds case again. Keen, tense, defensive, "They've got nothing on me. They never did." Co-worker, "Nobody said they did." Keen, "Doesn't matter. They can't prove anything." Ramirez replayed the tape over and over, analyzing every inflection. Keen wasn't denying knowing Angie. He wasn't even denying involvement. He was preparing for the walls to close in. 4. A risky move. 3 weeks into surveillance, Ramirez pushed for something bold, a controlled confrontation. "You sure about this?" Carter asked as they parked outside a small dive bar Keen frequented. "No," Ramirez admitted, "but if we spook him the right way, maybe he slips. We need him off balance." Inside, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke and the low hum of an old jukebox. Keen sat at the end of the bar nursing a whiskey, head down, hood pulled low. Ramirez slid onto the stool next to him, casual but deliberate. "Ramirez, Tommy Keen?" Keen looks up, startled. "Keen, do I know you?" Ramirez, "Not yet. I'm with Anchorage PD, been working a case from '98. Thought maybe you could help." Keen's jaw twitched. His hand froze halfway to his glass. "Keen, don't know nothing about no '98. Ramirez, leaning in, "That's funny. Because DNA says otherwise." Keen stood abruptly, tossing cash on the counter. "Keen, you cops need to leave me the hell alone." Ramirez watched him storm out, heart pounding. The hook was set. 5. The slip-up. 2 nights later, at 2:13 a.m., the surveillance team watched as Keen loaded black trash bags into the back of his truck. He drove to a secluded patch of woods and began digging. The task force moved in silently, night vision goggles cutting through the darkness. Keen froze as headlights flooded the clearing. "Carter," through megaphone, "Thomas Keen. Step away from the vehicle." He bolted. Officers chased him through knee-deep snow, breath ragged, boots crunching over ice. Finally, Ramirez tackled him hard, forcing him into the powdery ground. Ramirez, panting, cuffing him, "27 years, Tommy. It's over." Inside the trash bags, investigators found Angie's missing jewelry, pieces her family had mourned for decades. One of them, a silver locket, still had her initials engraved inside. 6. The interrogation. Back at APD headquarters, Keen sat handcuffed in a sterile interview room, beads of sweat rolling down his temples. Ramirez and Carter stood on the other side of the table, silent, letting the weight of the evidence settle. Ramirez, We've got your DNA. We've got Angie's locket. We've got you on tape talking about the case. Help yourself, Tommy. Tell us what happened. Keene stared at the table, jaw clenched. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights. Finally, he spoke. Keene, low, hoarse, she wouldn't stop screaming. I didn't mean to. The confession spilled out in fragments. Rage, panic, a drunken night gone horribly wrong. 7. Aftermath. By dawn, news of the arrest had spread across Anchorage. Reporters crowded outside the precinct, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. For Angie's family, the call they'd been waiting for finally came. Her younger sister, Rebecca Reynolds, sobbed quietly on the phone. Rebecca, we never stopped hoping. Thank you. Thank you for bringing her home. Ramirez sat alone in his car as the sun rose, exhaustion finally hitting him. He looked at Angie's photo one last time and whispered, Ramirez, we kept our promise. The case was far from over, the trial loomed, and Keene's defense would fight tooth and nail. But after 27 years of silence, Angie Reynolds finally had a voice again. February 2025, Palmer, Alaska. The snow came down heavy that morning, blanketing Palmer's quiet streets in silence. Inside the dimly lit operations room at the Alaska State Troopers headquarters, the mood was anything but quiet. The reopening of Mary Johnson's 1998 murder case had finally led them here, to the culmination of nearly 3 decades of frustration, dead ends, and sleepless nights. Detective Alejandro Ramirez stood over a corkboard littered with old photographs, DNA reports, and handwritten notes. His jaw was tense as he scanned the files one last time. 30 years, he muttered under his breath. 30 years she's been waiting for justice. Across the room, Agent Emily Carter of the FBI's Anchorage field office leaned against a table, flipping through the finalized warrant. She looked up at Ramirez, her blue eyes sharp. We've got one shot at this, she said. He's not the same man he was back then. If he senses we're onto him, he'll lawyer up, and we'll lose him for good. Ramirez nodded. Then we hit him hard and fast. The breakthrough that led to the arrest. 2 months earlier, the team had sent degraded DNA evidence, recovered from beneath Mary Johnson's fingernails in 1998, to a cutting-edge forensic lab in California. Advances in next-generation genealogical profiling had done what decades of old-school detective work couldn't: identify a match through distant relatives. The results pointed directly to Thomas "Tommy" Kincaid, now 54, living quietly in Wasilla, Alaska. Back in 1998, Tommy had been a 27-year-old seasonal logger with a history of bar fights and an anger problem. He'd fallen off the radar after the murder, moving from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to leave a trail. But science had finally caught up to him. Surveillance and planning. For 3 weeks, Ramirez's team shadowed Tommy. They watched as he clocked in at the small hardware store where he worked. They tracked him driving his beat-up blue Chevy pickup to and from a shabby cabin at the edge of the woods. They listened to his late-night conversations through wiretaps, hoping for even a hint of guilt. What struck Ramirez wasn't what Tommy said, but what he didn't. No mention of Mary. No slip-ups. No remorse. This guy's lived like a ghost for 30 years, Agent Carter said one night as they monitored a live feed from a nearby camera. He thinks he buried this forever. Ramirez leaned closer to the screen, his voice low and determined. Not anymore. The arrest. It was just after 6 a.m. when the unmarked SUVs rolled up the icy dirt road leading to Tommy's cabin. The snow crunched under boots as Ramirez, Carter, and 6 troopers surrounded the property. Inside, Tommy was making coffee when he saw the flashing lights through his frosted window. Bang, bang, bang. Alaska State Troopers. Tommy Kincaid opened the door. Ramirez's voice cut through the cold air. Tommy hesitated. Then came the sound of shuffling feet, a bad sign. Breach, Carter ordered calmly. Within seconds, the door was splintered open, and officers stormed in with weapons drawn. Tommy stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, a chipped coffee mug shaking in his hand. What the hell is this? He demanded, his voice gravelly with sleep and surprise. Thomas Kincaid, Ramirez said, stepping forward, badge displayed. You're under arrest for the 1998 murder of Mary Johnson. The mug slipped from Tommy's hand and shattered on the floor. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, his face pale. You'll have plenty of time to explain downtown, Carter said flatly, cuffing him as 2 troopers read him his rights. The interrogation. The interrogation room was small, windowless, and cold, deliberately so. Ramirez sat across from Tommy, a thick case file on the table between them. Carter leaned against the wall, silent but watchful. Tommy slouched in his chair, his cuffed hands resting on the metal table. His eyes darted nervously from Ramirez to Carter, then back to the case file. "You've been running for 30 years, Tommy," Ramirez began, his voice steady. "But science caught up with you." "I didn't kill her," Tommy shot back quickly. "I don't even know this Mary Johnson." Ramirez opened the file slowly, sliding a photo of Mary's smiling face across the table. "She was 19. You knew her, Tommy. You worked at the same logging camp. Witnesses saw you talking to her the night she disappeared." Tommy shook his head violently. No, that's not true. I didn't." Ramirez leaned in. "We found your DNA under her fingernails." The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. Tommy froze, his breath catching. Carter finally spoke, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "She fought you, Tommy. She scratched you. And now, 30 years later, that evidence is still screaming her name." Tommy's eyes welled with tears, his jaw trembling. He shook his head at first, whispering, No, but then something inside him seemed to crack. The confession. She wouldn't stop screaming," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. Ramirez stayed silent, letting the words spill. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted her to stop." Tommy's breathing quickened, his eyes distant now, as if replaying the night in his head. "What happened that night, Tommy?" Ramirez prompted softly. "She was leaving the bar. I followed her," Tommy said, tears finally streaming down his face. "I just wanted to talk, but she told me to get lost. I grabbed her arm, she scratched me, and then he broke off, burying his face in his hands." "You strangled her," Carter finished for him. Tommy nodded silently. "Where?" Ramirez asked. He hesitated, then muttered, "Behind the old mill, there's a trail by the creek. I left her there." The room fell silent except for Tommy's quiet sobs. Aftermath. As Tommy was led out of the interrogation room in handcuffs, Ramirez stood watching him go. Carter crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. 30 years, Ramirez said softly. "And now," Carter replied, "Mary finally gets to rest." Outside the station, news vans had already gathered, reporters shouting questions as cameras flashed. The story of a 27-year-old cold case cracked wide open was already making headlines across the country. Emotional fallout. For Mary's family, the arrest brought a bittersweet sense of closure. Her younger sister, Lena Johnson, now in her 40s, stood outside the courthouse, tears streaking her cheeks as she addressed reporters. "I've waited my whole life for this day," Lena said, clutching a worn photo of Mary. "Part of me is relieved, but another part just hurts all over again." And as the sun set over Juneau that evening, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Maggie Hayes whispered into the cold Alaskan air. "We found you, Linda. We never stopped looking. And now, you can rest." The trial was over. Fairbanks, Alaska, finally exhaled after holding its breath for nearly 3 decades. Families who had spent years haunted by unanswered questions could now find some peace. The courtroom was empty now, save for a few lingering echoes of grief and justice, but outside, the streets buzzed with cautious relief. Detective Alejandro Ramirez stood on the courthouse steps, his coat collar turned up against the biting late winter wind. Snowflakes drifted lazily around him, settling into the cracks of the old stone steps. He lit a cigarette despite knowing he shouldn't, inhaling deeply as if it might burn away the weight still pressing on his chest. Beside him, Agent Emily Carter scrolled through her phone, the pale blue light reflecting in her sharp eyes. "You'd think after 30 years, we'd finally get to breathe," Ramirez muttered, his voice low. Emily didn't look up. "Yeah, except we don't get to." Ramirez exhaled a stream of smoke, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the frozen Tanana River disappeared into white silence. "What do you mean?" Emily hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. A headline flashed across the display, bold and jarring against the gray afternoon. "Missing persons case in Nome takes dark turn. Authorities suspect serial killer." Ramirez frowned, snatching the phone for a closer look. The article was bare bones, just a few cryptic lines about 3 recent disappearances, eerily similar in nature. Young women. Remote outskirts. A single set of footprints leading into the snow, and never coming back. He cursed under his breath. Nome. Jesus. That's 500 miles from here. "Doesn't matter," Emily said, pulling her coat tighter. "Same patterns. Same age group. Same kind of staging. Whoever's doing this," she paused, lowering her voice. "They know what they're doing. And they've done it before. Ramirez stared at the screen again. Something cold, colder than the Alaskan wind, crept into his gut. You think we just closed one door, he said slowly, but we might have just opened another. Emily nodded once. Or worse. This one's been open the whole time. We just didn't see it. The two stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the sound of muffled traffic and distant gulls. Somewhere behind them, the courthouse doors slammed shut with a hollow finality. Finally, Ramirez crushed his cigarette under his boot and sighed. All right, he said. Pack a bag. We're heading to Nome. Emily smirked faintly, though her eyes betrayed her unease. I was hoping you'd say that. As they walked toward the parking lot, the snow began falling harder, swirling around them like a warning. Somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a shadow moved through the icy wilderness, silent, methodical, unseen. Another predator in the dark. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. 3 women vanished without a trace in Nome, Alaska. The trails are cold. The footprints lead nowhere. And the locals whisper about a predator hiding in plain sight.